Good evening. Evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Lewis, and I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science. On behalf of the department and the Luskin School of Public Affairs, it is my pleasure and distinct honor to welcome you to UCLA and to the 2015 Bollens-Ries-Hoffenberg Lecture. This lecture is a marquee event for us, and tonight is no exception. I'd like to begin with credit. Credit for tonight's program goes to the Bollens-Ries-Hoffenberg Lecture Committee, and I want to particularly recognize the efforts of John Karagosian, who's the chair of that committee, and who will close our program tonight with a few comments. Special thanks also go to our outstanding staff who do all of the hard work of putting this event together. The Department of Political Science and the Luskin School will be sponsoring more events like tonight's, including a departmental You Heard It Here on April 29th on the continuing legacy of the Waco standoff and the Oklahoma City bombing 20 years after. On April 14th, the Luskin School will hold an event on the role of arts and culture in public life, and you can visit our websites to learn more about these two events. Please also keep an eye out for these events and for others, and also consider supporting the kind of quality public interest programming and all of the wonderful and innovative teaching and research done in the Department of Political Science, the Luskin School, and all across the university. Established in 1985 as the Bollens-Ries Lecture, the lecture honors Professor John Bollens and Professor John Charles Ries. Known as Jack and Chuck, Bollens and Ries educated and mentored generations of students who went on to careers in public service in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and beyond. In 1991, the name of Professor Marvin Hoffenberg, one of the lecture's founders and counsels, was added to its list of honorees. Bollens and Ries sadly died far too young, Jack in 1984 and Chuck in 1987. We lost Marvin Hoffenberg in 2012 and his wife Betty in 2013. Their son Peter has continued to champion our department through the Sidney Stern Memorial Trust, and we're very pleased to add him to the lecture's honorary advisory committee this year. With us tonight, I'm very happy to say, are several members of the Bollens and Ries families, including Jack Bollens' sons, Scott and Ross, and his grandson, Eric, and also Chuck Ries's wife, Rita, his daughter, Mary, and his son, Jim. Thank you all for being here. We're honored to have you as part of our political science and UCLA families. There will be a reception immediately following tonight's program just outside the hall, and I invite everyone to join in. Finally, it's my pleasure to kick off tonight's program by introducing Arnie Berghoff, one of the lecture's founders, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Arnie earned his BA and MPA at UCLA. He was a student of both Bollens and Ries. Arnie has told me in the past that while he learned a great deal about state and local politics from Jack and Chuck, it was the mentoring that he received from both professors that deeply shaped and propelled his long career in government and politics. I'm sure that, that our honorees, many other students, many of whom are here tonight, would share in that sentiment and experience. Arnie's career includes a decade working for the Los Angeles City Council, stints working in government and public affairs positions with Southern California Gas, Pacific Enterprises, and BFI. And in 1998, Arnie founded the firm of Berghoff and Associates, and the firm has become a leader in public affairs advocacy with offices in Los Angeles and New York, serving such clients as Oracle, Cisco, Medtronic, and the city of Beverly Hills. Thank you, Arnie, for being here tonight and for all that you've done for the lecture. Arnie Berghoff.
Good evening. Close your eyes, it's 1975. Some of you can, most of us can remember that, but perhaps some of you, I know Zev can remember it. Shortly after Zev was elected, and it was an upset victory in an election, nobody expected him to win. I mean, nobody expected him to win. I was privileged to be part of a very small group, this is a true story, by the way, who gathered one evening for dinner with John C. Bollens. And if you knew John C. Bollens, and you certainly know him, there was a fair amount of wine and other assorted liquor around, and we were drinking, and we were talking about the election that had happened just the week previously. After a few glasses of wine, one member of our group asked John Bollens to give his interpretation of the election and his analysis and who won and who lost. In particular, the election of this guy, Zebs Yaroslavsky, who nobody ever heard of. He was a virtual unknown, long-haired, overweight, poorly dressed Jewish guy who elected to the city council. And no one would have thought, I'm being polite, by the way, that he would have ever won. So, but the interesting thing was, I mean, if you knew John Bollens, he was a very thoughtful guy, and he never just spoke. He thought before he spoke. And he sat for a few moments when someone asked him about what he thought of Zebs winning. And it was deep thought for a few moments. He furrowed his brow, and after what seemed like an uncomfortable eternity, he finally spoke and leaned over to the table and said to this guy, he goes, "This guy, Zebs, or whatever the hell his name is, will not last. After his one term in the council, this flash in the pan is going to be gone. Nobody's going to remember who the hell he is." He concluded, this is true, he concluded a comprehensive academic analysis of why this was true of this newly elected 5th council member by simply saying, "He's no Ed Edelman." Well, I believe, this is a true story, I believe that John Bollens made this assessment, I believe it, in part because he had supported Zebs' establishment and favorite opponent in the race, Roz Wyman, but also I think it was really in large part because he couldn't pronounce his last name. Even though the great John Bollens even the great John Bollens could get things wrong, and boy did he this time. Here we are gathered at UCLA, a home to many of us, if not all of us here, 40 years later to hear from someone who has become really no less than a legend in Los Angeles politics and actually in state politics as well. As a longtime LA lobbyist, I know that no one, and I mean no one, lasts very long in elected office by chance or by luck, especially not for 40 years. Zebs became a legend in LA not because he had amassed significantly more power than his city council colleagues or his Board of Supervisor colleagues. It's rather because he exhibited an extraordinary political skill, a strong personality, I think we'd all agree with that, and most importantly, that most valuable and scarce trait in government that I think is incredibly needing and lacking, and that's called leadership. Like him or not, Zebs has always been the one elected official who would pick up the flag and shout, "Follow me," and take the lead on very controversial and tough issues that others actually often ran away from. While solving some of these complex and local issues of our time, Zebs made many friends and frankly just as many enemies for sure. But I believe that this is evidence of leadership and his quest to always do what was best for LA. That was the only goal that he had. If it was best for LA, he could care less if you were his mother. It didn't matter. That he was going to do what was right for LA. As John Wooden once said, be more concerned with your character than your reputation, because your character is what you really are, while your reputation is merely what others think you are. Earlier this evening, a few of you asked me before when we were outside if I thought Zebs would miss being an influential and powerful elected official after 40 years of office. How is he going to handle it? How do you think he's going to deal with it? Well, the only thing I can say is, Zebs, I was once at a gathering shortly after Tom Bradley was mayor, and someone had asked him that exact question, and he thought for a minute, and here's how he responded. He said, "Every morning I wake up, I put on my bathrobe, I go out the front door, I pick up the LA Times. I open it up, I flip to the California section, then it was called the LA section, and I glance at all the problems that face LA. And then I fold the paper up and neatly under my arm and go back to bed for a couple hours." So I think that's really good advice, and I hope you practice it. I'm not sure if Zeb's going to take that advice, but I suspect we've not heard the last of him. It's my honor to introduce my dear friend for many, many years, Supervisor Zebs Yaroslavsky.
Thank you, Arnie, very much for that introduction. I'm glad to hear about Professor Bollens' views of me. It's one of the reasons I did not go to the political science department when I came to UCLA. There's something about them I just didn't trust. And apparently I thought correctly. But seriously, I'm honored to have been asked to give this lecture in honor of Professor Bollens and Professor Ries, Professor Hoffenberg. none of whom I ever studied under, which is my loss. But this has been a prestigious lecture. I know many of the people who have given it over the years, and I was honored when the committee and Arnie in particular called and asked me to give the speech, which I agreed to. And then he said, by the way, it's going to be published, so you need to write it out, you need to think it through. And I said, well, you know, I haven't read a speech since my bar mitzvah speech. And my bar mitzvah speech was a pretty good speech for a 13-year-old. So I'll do my best, but I did want to share some thoughts. And it's good to see so many of my former staff people here, and also of Ed Edelman's former staff people. Arnie, I think you were one, and Bill Canup I saw here, and John Karagosian, and there may be some others. And I want to just acknowledge Ed tonight, who is not well, as I think those of you know him know. Ed was, in so many ways, my mentor. I followed him into the city council, and I followed him into the Board of Supervisors. And the one thing Bollens said is true. I'm no Ed Edelman, and he was one of a kind. And I always thank my lucky stars that I got to navigate my little ship against his lighthouse. So let me just give you a few reflections, a couple of ideas that I've had. I have a lot of ideas, but you don't have time to hear all of them. So I tried to select three that would pique people's interest and maybe generate some discussion and debate, not just here tonight, but beyond. And then some reflections of 40 years in public office. So I'll start with the story. In 1983, Queen Elizabeth visited Los Angeles with her husband, Prince Philip. They were on an official visit to Los Angeles, and I was then a city councilman. And at the reception in their honor, I noticed that Prince Philip was off in the corner by himself. Everyone else was fawning over the Queen. I saw that the Duke of Edinburgh was alone, so I walked over to him. And I introduced myself, and I said, Your Royal Highness, that was probably the wrong title, but I'm Councilman Yaroslavsky. And he says, Councilman, he says, I don't understand your system of government. I've met the mayor, and I know who he is, and I've met the supervisors, though I don't know what they supervise. And now I meet you councilors. I don't understand the system. So I gave him about 2 minutes of the state-local government relationship, the state, 58 counties, thousands of cities and subdivisions of the counties, the special districts, including flood control, transit, air quality, and the all-important mosquito abatement district. And then he looked over his glasses and he said to me, he says, I think I now understand the genius of your system. And I said, really, what is it? He says, it's designed not to govern. Well, for those of us who have served in California local government, no observation could be more perceptive. Navigating the minefields of constitutional and legislative prescriptions in order to get anything done can be a mind-bending experience, and it certainly has been for me. From a historical perspective, there's a method to our state's madness. Like people, governments are the product of their environment. Many of California's seemingly duplicative and overlapping structures and regulatory barriers stem from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the Hiram Johnson reforms of 1912. They were a reaction to the overconcentration of power that gave corporate interests undue influence over legislation and government policy in general. Compartmentalizing or decentralizing decision-making was viewed, and to a large extent is still viewed, as the surest way to protect the state from a complete takeover by special interests. For good measure, the state constitution provides for a robust referendum process that gives the public the opportunity to reverse legislative decisions, and even gives citizens the right and the power to propose and enact legislation and funding measures that the legislature does not itself enact. However, the world has changed a little bit since 1912. Today, government is less able to confront challenges in a timely manner. I'm just going to move this here. See my bar mitzvah speech. Where was I here? See, I told you. The world has changed since 1912. Today, government is less able to confront challenges in a timely manner. Decades-old laws and regulations needlessly stand in the way of progress. Interest groups exert more influence over public sector decisions than ever before. And our old government structures are unable to keep pace with the demands of our time, to build on the successes we've achieved or reform that which has grown outdated, stale, or plainly ineffective. So my remarks today are designed to offer a few, but not an exhaustive list of suggestions on how governance can be improved upon in Los Angeles County and the state of California, and to reflect on some of the lessons that I've learned over 4 decades during which I served as an elected official in Los Angeles. First, I want to talk about county governance. The need to reform our county government system is self-evident to anyone who's observed it or who served in it. With a population of over 10 million people and an annual budget of over $27 billion, Los Angeles is the largest county in America. If it was its own state, it would be the 8th largest state in the Union, larger than Michigan. Yet, like 57 of the state's 58 counties, we are constrained by an old and tired governing structure prescribed by the state constitution. A 5-member Board of Supervisors, elected from geographic districts equal in population one to the other. The structure does not provide for an elected chief executive unless the people of the county choose to have one. So whether it's LA County with more than 10 million people, or Mono County, where cows outnumber people by 20 to 1, the governance system is the same. Only San Francisco has chosen a system that provides for an elected mayor and a textbook separation of powers between the mayor and the elected legislative body, the Board of Supervisors. Most people who have studied our county governance system have concluded that a 5-headed executive is not the most efficacious way to govern a county as big as ours. Can we imagine Michigan or Ohio dispensing with their governor in favor of a 5-member board? Our current system puts a premium either on parochial or consensus-based decision-making. Parochialism has its obvious drawbacks. In the 5-district structure, supervisors tend to judge prudent resource allocation and policy decisions by what percentage goes to their districts, rather than on where the need is the greatest. While building consensus is often a noble objective, it feels more like finding the lowest common denominator in mathematics. That number is always the least precise number. When a 5-member Board of Supervisors undertakes to bring solutions to bear on the complex social challenges that it faces, consensus is not necessarily a virtue. It often takes months, sometimes years, to reach consensus while problems linger. A recent example was the recommendation of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Child Safety, the recommendation to create an Office of Child Protection that could help cut through the thicket of bureaucracy that prevents timely collaboration and sharing of resources to address child abuse. That recommendation was made some 9 months ago. And as we sit here today, the Board of Supervisors has yet to select a permanent director for that office. Consensus was not reached under the previous board on which I served, and it hasn't been reached by the current board either, to my knowledge, unless something's changed. When dealing with child abuse, jail violence, transportation, water and air quality, unemployment, and economic development, we should strive as best we can for timely, evidence-based precision. The less precise our prescriptions are for our region's maladies, the less likely they will cure them. The stakes are too high for us to waste our time and resources on deferred decisions or strategies that don't work. 8 years ago, the Board of Supervisors approved a change to the county governance structure, creating the position of an appointed chief executive officer. Our hope was that the CEO would be the one person in our governing structure who could consider and propose policies and resource allocations with all of the people of the county in mind, especially our underserved and marginalized residents. That experiment did not work out as well as the board had intended and had hoped. The supervisors remained the only politically accountable government, people in the government, and the CEO remained the top bureaucrat, subject to pressure from individual board members or the board as a whole. In fact, the current board is poised to junk the appointed CEO model in the weeks ahead and return to the previous governance model where the board micromanaged every executive decision, large and small. I believe that Los Angeles County needs to restructure its governance by providing for an elected executive, an elected mayor, who would be electorally accountable to the entire county, not just 1/5 of it. Such an executive would institutionally speak and govern for all of us in conjunction with the Board of Supervisors. He or she would help set the county's fiscal and policy agendas, hire and fire its department heads, and run the largest county in America, like the governor of the 8th largest state of the Union should do. To achieve such a reform would require the placement of a charter amendment on the county ballot and its approval by a majority of the voters. To get this done, the civic leadership and community stakeholders must be convinced of the wisdom of such a change, and they must take the lead in promoting and sponsoring such a change. It can't come from politicians, whose motives would be instantly questioned by voters. On several occasions, I considered proposing a charter amendment to create an elected county executive, but each time I was suspected of doing so in order to create a position for which I could run. I didn't want to become the issue of such a campaign. It wouldn't have helped the campaign any. So I demurred. But I am convinced more than ever that if we engage our citizens in a dialogue on how their interests would be better served by this kind of reform than by the status quo, and if the civic leadership of this town were to take the lead in such an effort, it could succeed. The majority of our citizens believe that county resources should be invested where the need is greatest, not divided up by artificial political districts. It is clear by looking around that the status quo has not entirely achieved that objective, despite our best efforts, or to the extent that we have succeeded, we have been too slow in getting there. There is another way, and our region should pursue it. Another part of the status quo puzzle that cries out for change is the requirement that local taxes be approved by not only by a vote of the people, but by a 2/3 vote at that. This state constitutional requirement dates back decades and was broadened by corollary initiatives over the last 35 years. An honest assessment of the 2/3 requirement would have to conclude that it's a mixed bag. After all, several countywide measures have been approved despite the high bar for passage. Those included Measure B in 2002, which I authored, that assessed a 3-cent per square foot tax on improved property to prevent the total collapse of our trauma and emergency medical service system. This was the first countywide property tax approved by voters for a human service since the passage of Proposition 13, and it passed with a 73.8% vote. It also included the passage of Measure R in 2008, which I co-authored with Mayor Villaraigosa. This was the 30-year half-cent county sales tax earmarked for public mass transit and highway improvements. The tax won approval with just over 68% of the vote, an improbable outcome given that it took place on November 4th, the election took place on November 4th, 2008, the epicenter of the greatest economic earthquake since the Great Depression. Both of those measures were high priorities for the voting public. 9 of the county's 21 trauma centers had been shuttered in the years preceding 2002, and more were threatened to close. Voters understood that they were one drunk driver or heart attack away from needing these vital emergency services, and the average $60 a year tax was a small price for people to pay in order to have those services when they needed them. The immunity of Measure R, the transit tax, to the economic collapse of 2008 can only be explained by the voters' deep and abiding frustration with traffic congestion and its impact on their quality of life. Our initial polling early in 2008 showed that the sales tax measure was hovering right around 2/3, the required percentage for approval. In August, as the economy went into freefall, I called the mayor and I strongly suggested that before we launch a multi-million-dollar campaign, we should poll one more time to see if public support is still strong. The survey showed no slippage in voter backing whatsoever, even as there was an impending run on the banks. I was skeptical. I'm still skeptical. I was skeptical, but both the mayor and I trusted our polling, trusted our research, and we proceeded. I have to confess that to this day, I don't completely understand how that measure passed, except to conclude that our intractable traffic congestion problems weighed more heavily on voters' minds at that moment than the economic collapse. And that's saying something about people's views of our traffic problems. However, these weren't the only measures that were placed on the ballot in recent years. Several others were narrowly defeated. Measure J in 2012 was an extension of the 2008 transit tax, garnered 66.15% of the vote, falling just 15,000 votes short of passage. A bond measure in 2002 that would have funded the seismic retrofit of some of our most iconic cultural buildings, including the Natural History Museum and Exposition Park, the Music Center, and the County Museum of Art, fell less than 5 percentage points short. And a measure just this past year, in 2014, to fund parks and recreation facilities countywide fell short by a similar margin, garnering 63% of the vote. In most other states, such a supermajority would be considered a landslide victory. Only in California, with its high threshold for approval of funding measures, could 66.15% be a losing campaign. Our state's laws ignore the majority rules principle that has been inculcated in our minds since grammar school. The notion that critical public safety, recreation, cultural, or transit investments can be held hostage to 33.34% of the voters is frustrating in the extreme. It's high time that the state revisit the two-thirds requirement for local taxes. Since boards of supervisors and city councils are required to gain voter approval for tax increases and can't impose them on their own, a more achievable threshold is in order. School bonds, for example, already require only 55% for approval, and a similar threshold should be considered for measures that would fund other vital services. Any change to the two-thirds requirement would necessitate an amendment to the state constitution. The legislature, and that would be a vote of the people of the state. The people would have to vote to amend the Constitution. The legislature has been considering placing a proposal on the 2016 ballot that would do just that. I'm hopeful that a fair and responsible measure will give California voters the opportunity to provide local government with a higher probability of successfully funding initiatives that the majority of our voters consider important. Finally, our broken campaign finance system has exponentially increased the influence of special interests in our political process. The United States Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case, among others, has opened the spigot, allowing unlimited special interest money to flow into campaigns. Powerful interests, corporate, labor, and wealthy individuals who already had more than enough influence over our electoral system can now spend mind-boggling sums to elect their candidates through their so-called independent expenditure committees, otherwise known as IEs, while contributions to candidates-controlled committees remain strictly limited. This puts the citizen candidate, a guy like I was in 1975, at a distinct disadvantage in his or her run for office. Candidates who exhibit political independence invite a deluge of spending against them by forces who are disinclined toward public officials who have minds of their own. In local politics, as in state and national politics, candidates who are funded by these IEs have their message communicated to voters, while those who are not so funded are drowned out. Moreover, when millions of dollars in IEs are spent to elect a legislator, a county supervisor, a mayor, or a city councilman, they are expected to return the favor, and far too often they do. Indeed, the main casualty of these court decisions has been political independence. It is rare these days to see a genuine debate on issues where differing points of view are publicly aired, where a deliberative body truly deliberates. Too often, decisions are made unanimously without meaningful discussion or constructive give and take. It's almost as though our elected governmental bodies have become one-party institutions who are told what to think by the very interests who funded their campaigns. As UCLA alumnus Bill Walton said a few weeks ago in his color commentary on one of the basketball games, he said, "When everyone thinks alike, nobody thinks." Occasionally, a citizen initiative or a citizen candidate does beat the House. In 1988, my late colleague Marvin Browdy and I launched a ballot initiative to repeal Occidental Petroleum's ill-advised permit to drill for oil on the Pacific Palisades coastline. Some of you may remember that campaign and that issue. We were outspent 3-1 by Dr. Hammer and his corporation, but we narrowly prevailed by a 52-48 margin, ending that two-decade saga. In 2013, Mitch O'Farrell won his Los Angeles City Council seat in District 13 in Hollywood, despite being massively outspent by organized labor's choice, who had far more resources as well as the political establishment behind him. And then there was my first campaign, my first election to the City Council, which Arnie touched on, when I was outspent 2.5-1 by a candidate who had the endorsements of both United States senators. Virtually every single elected official who represented the council district, with the exception of 2, Tony Bielenson and Ed Edelman, stayed neutral, for which I've been eternally grateful. I made it into the runoff by a mere 359 votes, beating Roz Wyman by 359 votes. She came in third, I came in second. Fran Savage, who some of you may recall, led going away in the primary, 33% to my 19%, to Roz's 18%. I won the general, obviously, being outspent 2.5-1. I'm not sure that I could never have done that under today's rules. Never be able to get elected under today's rules, because I was able to go to my mother-in-law in 1975 and ask her to lend me a bunch of money. I couldn't do that today. And I couldn't go to any friends who were dumb enough to invest their money in my campaign. So I have a kind of a personal stake in this, a retroactive personal stake, because I know what the impact of these campaign finance laws are. So yeah, occasionally David does defeat Goliath, but that tends to be the exception, as it was in the Bible, the exception to the rule. So what can be done about this troubling state of affairs? Neither the Supreme Court nor Congress are likely to change course anytime soon. We can hope that one day reason will be restored to our campaign finance laws by allowing constitutionally enforceable limits on all campaign contributions and campaign spending. Indeed, President Obama has called for a constitutional amendment that would moot the Citizens United decision, but that's not likely to happen anytime in our lifetime. In the meantime, something needs to be done to level the playing field. Public financing of campaigns, something that I didn't always embrace, has clearly made a difference in Los Angeles city elections. It has given candidates who couldn't self-fund or couldn't count on special interests to fund an independent expenditure campaign on their behalf a fighting chance to be heard. In order to broaden that opportunity, local jurisdictions should institute or expand public financing laws as much as their treasuries will allow. Candidates with the most resources to communicate their message don't always prevail, but most often they do. Greater public financing will increase the probability that community-based candidates, independent candidates, will be able to credibly challenge entrenched and well-funded interests. In doing so, our governing institutions are more likely to reflect the political diversity of our region, a diversity that is not currently reflected on any of our local bodies. However, and we have to be honest about this, there aren't enough funds in any city budget to completely level the playing field against special interest campaigns. In Los Angeles alone, it would take tens of millions of dollars per election to adequately fund community candidates who face the onslaught of the interests who, with one stroke of the pen, can infuse millions of dollars into each contested race. It is patently unfair for a candidate to be strictly limited in the amount he or she can raise from a supporter, think me, while his opponent can spend unlimited personal funds or benefit from massive, unlimited expenditures on his or her behalf. It's a terribly unlevel playing field. A community-based candidate does not have to match the spending of his better-funded opponent, dollar for dollar, but he does need to have a sufficient war chest to be heard in the electoral competition. As long as Citizens United and its analogs are in force, fundraising limits on candidate-controlled committees should be lifted. This is a very controversial statement, so I want you to, you're all dozing off here. I want you to know that this is my controversial statement of the evening. As long as Citizens United is in force, fundraising limits on candidate-controlled committees should be lifted in order to give independent-minded or community-based candidates a credible chance to compete. LA County made a serious effort to partially address this inequity in 1996. In that year, long before Citizens United, Measure B was overwhelmingly approved by county voters, providing for the lifting of contribution limits for candidates who faced opponents who chose to spend more than $300,000 of their own money on a campaign. That was a measure that I wrote, and I will say now, without any bashfulness, I did it as an act of self-preservation. Because in the era of Dick Reardon's and others who could spend with one stroke of the pen, write themselves a check for $8 million, it was unthinkable that I would be held a prisoner to a law that most of you probably think is a great law, as I do, limiting campaign spending, but you can't limit campaign spending on some and not on others. And so we wrote that law, and it was approved overwhelmingly by voters in LA County. The first meaningful test of that law actually took place just this past year, 2014, in the election to fill my own supervisorial seat. It didn't completely level the playing field, but it enabled the ultimate winner to adequately communicate her message and win a relatively close election. Absent this provision, the election outcome might have been quite different. Now I want to just turn to another subject, which is when Arnie called me, invited me to present this prestigious lecture, it was suggested that I share some of the lessons I learned in the rough and tumble of my public service career. And I'm happy to do so through what I've termed Zebs axioms, lessons learned during 4 decades in public service. And these are just 10 of the multitude of axioms that I assure you are a work in progress. The first one is good policy is usually good politics. I credit former Congressman Howard Berman for suggesting this to me when I was a first-time candidate for the City Council in 1975. Doing what's right is good policy. I always operated on the assumption that if I was accessible and listened to all sides, gave respectful consideration to all points of view, and based my decisions on a fair and intelligent analysis of facts and evidence, even the constituents who were at the losing end of my decisions would respect me and not hold it against me at election time. After all, if my decision was right, it would become apparent in due course. Citizens usually appreciate an elected leader who makes political sacrifices and takes political risks for what he or she thinks is sound policy, even when they don't agree with him. And that's not only good policy, but it's also good politics. Second axiom is work as hard the day after the election as you do the day before. Public confidence is not inspired and elections are not won by waiting until election time to do one's job. Working hard for 4 years is the way one gets things done. Every time I moved the public policy dial or solved a problem for a community or an individual, I banked those achievements in the form of public confidence and goodwill. It takes time to achieve major public policy goals, sometimes more than 1 term in office, sometimes more than 3 terms in office. And I've had those too. When granted a 4-year term, one really has no time to waste if achievement is truly the objective. I don't recall an election night, even when I was unopposed, when I wasn't at work first thing the next morning. That attitude, as much as anything, got me elected 11 times by a highly educated and politically engaged constituency in the west side of Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley. Third, the length of a debate is inversely proportional to the importance of an issue. There's a corollary to this maxim that was coined by John Wooden, Coach John Wooden, who said, "Never mistake activity for achievement." All of us are tempted to spend too much time on unimportant things that don't result in meaningful results. In life, we are given a limited amount of time to make an impact, and every moment counts. In government, we can interminably debate a procedural item while losing sight of the mission-critical matter that was before us in the first place. We've certainly seen that in Congress in recent years, and we've had plenty of that in local government as well. Our citizens depend on us and expect us to use the time allotted to get product out the door. Oftentimes, that product can save lives, and it certainly can improve our quality of life. We owe it to the people who elect us to focus on their interest at the exclusion of petty political machinations. We don't have a minute to waste. Fourth, don't be afraid to change course when you're on the wrong course. In her book, The March of Folly, Barbara Tuchman defined folly as a policy that is undertaken despite incontrovertible evidence that the course you are on is the wrong course. More tragedies than I care to remember have occurred when decision makers have let their stubbornness trump evidence and common sense. In our own nation and in our own lifetime, we can recall LBJ in the Vietnam War, George W. Bush in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and there are hundreds and hundreds of others. Tuchman went on to write that a perverse persistence in a policy that is demonstrably unworkable and counterproductive is also folly. When initial assumptions about a particular policy initiative haven't turned out as anticipated, there's no shame in changing course. Whatever shame is associated with admitting a mistake is far less politically costly than pursuing a flawed policy that will ultimately be revealed as such. And I can tell you that her book was my Bible. And more often than I can remember, I followed that adage. Cut your losses. If you're on the wrong course, cut your losses now, because you're eventually going to have to cut your losses later. It's less painful to do it early than it is to do it late. And more politicians, and frankly more corporate leaders, should have that in mind. I highly recommend her book, March of Folly. Next, it's better to negotiate with a strong adversary than with a weak one. To a lot of people, that's counterintuitive. But a strong adversary is more likely to be able to make a deal than a weak one, because he has the confidence that he can sell his agreement to his side. A weak adversary believes that there is no deal good enough to take to his constituency without being devoured. Whether it's negotiating a labor contract, a development agreement, a transit project, or frankly, a Middle East peace treaty, it is easier to get to yes if your negotiating partner is capable of making a deal. A current local issue illustrates this point. The controversy over the route of the West Side subway through Beverly Hills, under the high school property, would have been resolved long ago if its city and school district had the self-confidence to meet the MTA halfway to resolve the matter. And there is a halfway point. They didn't, because they're afraid they can't sell it to their constituency. And instead, they have spent nearly $10 million fighting the project in court. And they've lost, and they have nothing to show for it. And now they want to go out to the voters and raise more bond money. Next, when doing something revolutionary, call it a pilot program. More often than not, attempting to change a paradigm runs head-on into the forces whose interests are served by protecting the status quo. Implementing a pilot that tests the reform can often lower the defenses of those status quo defenders. When I sought to change the way in which the county addressed its homeless crisis by adopting a housing-first policy, this goes back 8 years now, politicians and agencies whose bread were buttered by the status quo, by the old paradigm, circled the wagons and would have none of it. So instead of enacting a broad change countywide, I proposed a pilot project on Skid Row aimed at demonstrating that the new approach was more efficacious and cost-effective. If I was right, it would open the door to a broader application of the reform. If I was wrong, I'd pull the plug on the pilot. Very simple. Once a pilot proved successful, it was politically more difficult, if not impossible, to oppose it. And thanks to our Skid Row project, a pilot project, Project 50, Housing First now underpins this region's policy for eradicating homelessness. It would have been nice if we could have done it all at once, but pilot worked. Next, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you are. One of my early mentors and political heroes, the late Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, gave me that piece of advice when I first got started, and I took it to heart. My office was always known for having strong and intelligent staff, and I was very proud of that. And quite a few of them are here today, and I thank them collectively and individually. Scoop Jackson said to me, if you don't hire the best, you'll end up doing your work as well as theirs, and you'll have to clean up their mess. A good leader must be comfortable enough in his own skin to bring people into his orbit who bring added value to the organization. I encourage those who reported to me to think outside the box, to challenge me, to not be afraid to disagree with me, or tell me when I was about to walk off a cliff. I was always blessed in having the smartest staff in the business, and I attribute whatever success I've had to them. Always acknowledge people and treat them with respect. I learned that the hard way. In one of my city council re-election campaigns, I walked door to door soliciting votes from my neighbors on my own block. I came to Mr. Sauer's door. Mr. Sauer was a baker my dad was one of his biggest customers, retail customers. And I came to his door and I asked him to sign my petition and put a lawn sign up. And he said, I wouldn't vote for you for dog catcher. And I asked him why. To which he responded that I jogged by his house every day and I never acknowledged him when he was on his front porch. I explained that I never wore my glasses when I jogged and I couldn't see him. He didn't buy the explanation and I lost his vote. From that day on, I say hi to everyone who's within eyeshot, whether I can see him or not. Next, when a politician goes to a public meeting and can't find a parking place, it's not going to be a good meeting. I learned that the hard way too. At the onset of the Proposition 13 revolution in 1977, I attended a community meeting in Cheviot Hills. I know there are some Cheviot Hills residents here. The gym, with the capacity of 180 people, was jammed with over 450 residents, standing room only. The crowd was made up of people whose property tax bills had just been increased fourfold in 1 year, in one property tax cycle. Needless to say, it wasn't going to be a good meeting. After that experience, I came prepared. I didn't come prepared that night, prepared for the worst case scenario at the hundreds of town hall meetings that I attended over these 40 years. In walking into a hostile crowd, my objective was to have the people leave satisfied that I had addressed the issue that brought them there in the first place, or that I would at least give it the best shot I had. Indeed, walking into a hostile crowd and having my constituents leave feeling it was worth their while became the favorite challenge of my job. Nobody ever understood this. One of my colleagues in government once leaned over to me at a homeowners meeting and said, I don't understand how you did this for 20 years as a city councilman. And I explained what I just explained to you, that it's like a preacher, who's out trying to convert people. And if you get somebody to bite, it's made your day. And for us to get somebody to bite meant that we had satisfied them on a problem that they'd come to get resolution on. Finally, the last axiom, and it's a good one. Good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment. All of us have a tendency to avoid making difficult and controversial decisions. Conventional wisdom is that if one avoids a decision, he or she can't be criticized. However, in any walk of life, leaders need to decide, even if it means taking risks, even if it means alienating people. Failure to do so results in stagnation or even regression, for which one can be criticized as well. I was never afraid to take calculated risks when confronting complex policy challenges or contentious neighborhood controversies. My constituents not only didn't mind my doing so, they expected me to do so. My record wasn't perfect, and I made my share of mistakes. However, the risk of making a mistake never stopped me from taking chances in the interest of good public policy. When I made a bad judgment call, I would chalk it up to experience. I would try not to make the same mistake twice. I'd learn from it and build a reservoir of good judgment that served me well in the ensuing months and years. In the end, admitting one's mistakes and learning from them is a sign of strength, not of weakness. So as I look back, my overarching observation is this. We live in a democracy with all of the assets and liabilities, the pluses and minuses that the system affords. Our citizens are not as uninformed as many in the political class think they are. And if our political and governance systems treat the public with respect, the public will reciprocate. That's been my experience. People have the capacity to distinguish between substance and nonsense, but they can only do so if they are informed by a robust debate that represents the breadth of the political and policy spectrum of our community. The people of the city and county of Los Angeles have given me a singular opportunity to help govern this region for 4 decades. When I retired last year, I was asked many times what was I most proud of and what were my greatest regrets. It's difficult to single out particular achievements that mean more to me than others. In retrospect, I can honestly say that I accomplished what I set out to do and then some. Well, and then some. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I took office the first time, so it was a lot of then some. I'm proud of some of the big things, like the Orange Line busway in the San Fernando Valley, and Rick Thorpe, who's helped build that. He's now helping to build the Exposition Light Rail line, is here, and I'm glad he was able to take a night out to hear me speak one more time. Whether it was the Orange Line in the San Fernando Valley, the extension of the Wilshire Subway, which is now broken ground, and the Exposition Light Rail line to the beach, which will open up at the end of this year, early next year. Whether it was changing the way this county dealt with homelessness, keeping the city and county solvent in the face of daunting fiscal challenges, taking on the LAPD's policies that violated civil rights and civil liberties when few, if any, political leaders would dare do so, expanding healthcare services to the medically underserved communities of our region, adding some 20,000 acres of open space to the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, and renovating or adding to our county's cultural infrastructure, including Disney Concert Hall, LACMA, the Hollywood Bowl, the Natural History Museum, the San Fernando Valley Performing Arts Center, among many others. Those are some of the things that I put in my list of things that I'm proud of. But I'm just as proud of helping an African-American employee of Holloway Cleaners in West Hollywood get admitted to the LAPD Academy many years ago after the system militated against him. He is now an LAPD captain. Or helping a woman retrieve her cell phone that she thought was permanently lost when it fell into a city storm drain. Or working with students to improve traffic safety at a West Side intersection where one of their classmates had been killed by a speeding driver. Or by expediting the restoration of electric power to a neighborhood before they lost 2 weeks' worth of provisions in their refrigerators. Or by preventing a Holocaust survivor from being unjustly evicted from her Fairfax area apartment. The landlord of that apartment was a Holocaust survivor. As for regrets, I have few, actually. I never dwelled on what might have been because the time spent looking back is time not looking ahead. The one regret I do have is that my parents did not live long enough to see how I turned out. I think they deserved that opportunity and would have been proud of both me and my sister. After 40 years, I conclude that I was like a proselytizing preacher who roamed his territory, converting cynics into believers, that a call to their elected representative didn't have to end in disappointment, that government could work for them. Those of us who are elected to public office have a profound responsibility to represent each and every citizen, those who can take care of themselves, but especially those who can't. I was always guided by the words of 19th century British historian Lord Thomas Macaulay, who wrote, "No man is fit to govern great societies who hesitates about disobliging the few who have access to him for the sake of the many he will never see." It has been my privilege to govern our great society here in Los Angeles for these many years, and I want to thank each and every one of you for giving me that opportunity. Thank you very much.
You'll take a few questions.
Yeah.